So if everything has gone well in your setup phase, then we should be ready to skin the mesh to the skeleton. Right now I have a fully functioning rig with IK arms and legs and some set-driven keys for the fingers, etc., but the mesh is not doing anything. So what we're going to have to do next is to unlock the geometry layer so that we can bind the skeleton to the mesh, and then there's going to be the extensive process of making sure that it deforms correctly. This can be a lengthy process, even though it's a fairly straightforward one. There's not a whole lot to know in terms of commands and button presses, but it can be a delicate process because the mechanics underlaying skinning can be a little bit arcane to students. So what I'm going to do is switch to a more simple setup to demonstrate how exactly skinning works and how it affects, how the bones affect the mesh. Here I have a cylinder with 3 bones, and they are not currently bound to each other. The bones don't do anything. They're just named joint 1, 2, and 3. And as you can see, I can just rotate in the middle. So we'll treat this just as a basic sort of limb. First, to bind the mesh and the skeleton together, we need our rigging menu skin, and here's the bind skin option. There is a interactive bind skin option, which is very interesting. It's a little bit complicated. I'm going to go with the tried and true plain method right now, but I would encourage you to explore and interact and try this interactive bind skin. When I tried it, it was pretty cool. I'm not sure if it's going to be faster than some of the other methods that I'm already familiar with, but it allows you to use sort of manipulators to determine where the influence fall off is for each bone. There's also an unbind skin option, so sometimes you're going to have to detach a skin and reattach it. Just know that that will potentially destroy all of the detail work that you've done in painting all of the weights for the skin. So approach that with caution. And then finally, in this very upper section, there's a whole bunch of other stuff in here, but just pay attention to these first 4. We've got go to bind pose. Bind pose is a concept of where the skeleton was when you bound the skin in the first place. It's an important thing to know because if you have to unbind or rebind, then you need to be in the bind pose. And if your controllers were zeroed, this is likely where the bind pose is also. So just know that your skeleton, your controllers, they have to be in their default position before you bind skin in the first place. So let's select just the root bone of our skeleton and shift select our mesh and go to skin, bind skin. We're going to go to the option box for this. So there are a couple of different bind methods and also things that we can bind to. Just reset settings, edit reset settings in case you're not sure that these are the default settings. First, binding to, right now it says joint hierarchy. That means the entire skeleton. It doesn't matter if you select just one bone or the root bone or whatever. This will bind your mesh to the entire skeleton. We can also have selected joints or an object hierarchy. Selected joints is another interesting one where if you have parts of your body that are going to be affected by only a couple of bones, you can specifically select them. We'll use that one when we're binding the eyeballs to the eyeball bones because we only want each eyeball to be affected by one bone. And we can also use this if we were selecting, say, the arm meshes that are separate from the torso or the feet that are separate from the pants. It's a good way to just segregate certain parts of the body, but just know that this is a semi-permanent choice, that you should never use selected joints if you're not sure. Instead, just use the entire skeletal system and you can paint 0 on those joints. But selected joints means you are bound only to these joints and never to more. So you'd have to unbind and rebind. So let's just choose joint hierarchy. Bind method is another interesting one. Closest distance is the most primitive one, but it works in just about all instances. It can have errors. Then we've got closest in hierarchy, which don't mess around with unless you know what that means. Heat map, which is a cool one in which it tries to judge the distance between other joints and how much influence each one should have. And then geodesic voxel, which is a sort of method of dividing space in 3 dimensions. So heat map has a lot of great potential. Geodesic voxel is sort of a worst case scenario thing, and closest distances are default. We've also got skinning method, classic linear, dual quaternion, weight blended. I tend to not mess with this. I don't quite know what that means. I'm just going to stick with classic linear. And then normalized weights, interactive, post, then, I don't know, weight distribution, distance or neighbors. This one can be important actually because distance will try to judge in space how far apart your joints are. Neighbors is usually the better choice when it comes to fingers and hands. Think about how the joints are connected. The joints of a finger are connected to each other, but not connected to the neighboring finger. So this means that you'll get less errors when it comes to your hands typically. So I do like to pick that one oftentimes. And that could also have closest hierarchy can also affect that. Max number of influences, how many bones maximum should affect one vertex. 5 is the default. You can leave it there. You can lower it oftentimes, but raising it would only ever happen with very, very complicated rigs. And then drop-off rate is just in space. How quickly does it try to transfer? You can just leave that default because we're going to paint things in. So with that done, I'm going to hit apply and close this. And so now you should see that your skeleton, your joints, take on a colored appearance. And if you rotate them with your controllers, because on your rig, it's going to use the controllers, you should be able to see that the mesh interacts. And if you have access to bones that aren't controlled, you should be able to move them and they will interact as well. Okay, so essentially job done, except for likely the way that it's bending is ugly. So for instance, if I bend what is essentially this elbow in the middle of the cylinder, I'm getting this very Gumby-like bend where it's soft on both sides and it's starting to pinch. And if I bend far enough, then it gets very, very small. These can be the kind of errors that we're looking to alleviate. Now, if you are messing with your skeleton directly, then it can be fraught because you don't know how to reset everything necessarily. You can even move parts of the skeleton like this. You can really mess it up because we can always come back and come to skin, go to bind pose. But in your case, since you've got controllers driving your skeleton already, you shouldn't be too rough with the skeleton itself. Okay, it can help sometimes to see the position change and how the mesh responds to it. But I would advise you, if you've done it the method that we just did and have controllers on your skeleton, just use the controllers to move the thing as you're painting. It is a good thing to move the skeleton before we paint our weights because it's more obvious what the change is. If you leave it in its default pose, there's going to be no visible change in the position of the mesh, which can lead to errors and also unexpected results. So I'm going to bend this over 90 degrees like that. How we actually start editing the paint weights is by selecting the mesh, right-click and hold, come down to Paint, Skin Cluster, and choose Paint Weights. Okay, mine turns rainbow colored. Yours will turn black and white at first. Open the Tool Options menu, Tool Settings, and close the outliner because it's just going to get in the way. You have an outliner right here. And to get your mesh looking colored, come down to Gradient and choose Color Ramp. This is the default. So 100% weight represents white and 0 is black. And the problem with this is that I can't tell what's gray and black or what's gray and white. So if I use Color Ramp like that, you do still have white and black at 100%, but you have colors for every other percentage. So if it's white, you're guaranteed that's 100% ownership. If it's black, you're guaranteed that's 0% ownership. If it's any color in between, it's sharing between the neighbors. So what we're looking at now is joint 1, and this heat map essentially is showing us how much ownership joint 1 has over the mesh. Joint 2 has a slightly different distribution, and joint 3 has another different distribution. So the bluer it is, the less influence. So right now we're looking at joint 3, this one on the very tip. It has a medium amount of influence on the cap, and then less as it comes to the elbow, and virtually none, but not 0, when it comes to the bottom of the cylinder. Joint 2, which is this one right here, and by influence, this bone right here, has a medium amount of influence on the elbow and the upper part, and a minimal amount as we go down to the bottom. Joint 1 has the most amount of influence on the base, a medium amount, and then less when it comes out here. So what are we doing with this tool? If you take a look at the tool settings panel, we've got different modes, we've got different paint options, we've got different profiles. So let's start looking through these one by one. Your mode, most of the time, isn't going to change unless you have a need to select only certain parts of the mesh. So we could change to selection mode and now drag around certain vertices to only affect them, and then switch back to paint mode, and now no matter what we do, it will only paint on those vertices. Okay, I'm going to do select again and just click off, return to paint, and now I have nothing selected, unfortunately. The default is all, so we should be able to see. We can't do that because the bones are still showing, and now I've got my tool settings panel open, but I have nothing selected and everything's messed up. Okay, let's go back to object mode, right click and hold, and we go to, oops, I'm still in the tool actually. Right click and hold, and we can change all of the options down here. So I want to just select all. I'm in select mode right now. I want to select all. So I can choose vertexes, grab a few, and there's a keyboard shortcut for expanding our selection. It would be Shift and period. Every time I tap Shift period, I select more and more vertices. Now I've got all the vertices selected. I can come back to paint mode, and now I'm affecting all of them. Essentially, it's a helper tool for when it's difficult for you to select certain parts of the mesh. You can also do paint select instead. So now I'm selecting, or I believe it's Control to deselect, Shift. I don't remember. But you can paint select as well. Oh, sorry, it's right here. Paint select, remove. There we go. So now I'm painting out my selection. These are just helpers. Generally speaking, you're not going to need to go into either one of these modes unless you have a problem, and just stick to paint mode. But if, like me, you've just messed around with it and it's confusing, just hit W to go back to your manipulator, return to object mode, select your mesh one more time, right click and hold, paint, skin cluster, paint weights, and now those selections no longer matter. You're back into paint mode, or you should be. All right, so with that aside, most of the time we're going to spend is in paint mode. Paint operation. So we've got replace, add, scale, and smooth. And we've got the profile, which is sort of like the brush shape. If you want, when you are painting your weights, for it to have a influence which affects other vertices, choose the soft round brush. If that's annoying and it's affecting too much or too little, then select the next one over, which is a little bit soft. If you want absolute tight control, select the hard one and don't worry about anything else there. I tend to, if I'm smoothing things, go for the very softest one or the medium one. And if I'm adding or replacing weights, I tend to go for the hard one. But as a happy medium, we'll just start here and you can decide if you want to change that. Replace means whatever the weight value is right now, we're going to give it the weight value down here in the value field. So right now, the opacity is set to 100%. So whatever I'm doing it as completely as I can. And I'm replacing the value and replacing it 0. So for joint 1, the very first joint, this one, wherever I paint right now, it's going to give no influence, 0 influence at all. Before I actually start painting, the very last thing you need to know is that the size of this brush is controllable. There is a slider. I usually don't use the slider. I just use a keyboard shortcut. I believe it's one of these two. But rather than using that, just go ahead and close that. Hold down the letter B and then left click and drag left and right. And this is the brush size. Okay. So I tend to set it to slightly smaller than the size of a polygon face, like that. So I'm going to paint on with 100%, a value of 0. You can see that the mesh is changing shape as I do this, and the colors are changing a little bit. So I'm just dragging around, and vertexes are the things affected, so that's usually where you're going to be clicking and dragging. You can see the projected brush on the surface, and note that although I'm replacing this with a value of 0, it's not turning black right away. It should. If everything else was even, then it would turn black immediately. But it's sort of turning dark blue, and then spots are turning black. So it's sort of doing it, but I have to click repeatedly in order to get it to activate. This may be because down here in the stroke settings, I've got something that's softening this brush down here, like I think the radius L, lower brush radius limit, upper brush radius limit. I don't know entirely, but it should be replacing them. It could be because of the soft brush profile. So if I select this one, this harsher one, it's going to, go to black a lot more readily. There we go. So I'm just going to use that and paint 0% influence here all over the cap and all over that first line of vertexes. So now you can see this joint has no influence on where these vertices are going. So where did that influence go? Well, it went to the other two joints. Joint 2 now has more influence than it did, and joint 3 now has more influence than it did. Replace is an interesting one because you can either go higher or lower depending on the value. So if we set it to 100%, let's give joint 3 100% influence over those vertexes. So now it's turning them white. And if it were blending at all, it would start turning them reddish. But let's just paint all over there. So first you select the joint, and then you paint with your brush settings. So now this joint has 100% ownership over this. So it should be black in joint 2 and black in joint 1. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and just hit W to move the joints to verify that. There you go. You can see parts of the mesh look jiggly because it's got a little bit of influence over there. And if I rotate this, then that cap is absolutely rigid, but everything in between is squishy feeling. Okay. And if you mess with your skeleton directly, then you want to return to bind pose, go to bind pose. But if you're just using your controllers, you don't even have to reset this between painting operations. Don't even worry about it. And just reset your controllers instead to get back to your default pose. So at this point, let's go ahead and go back, paint, skin cluster, skin paint weights. Let's look at some of the other operations. I will warn you though, replace is great for a starting tool, but it's worse the further into the adjustments you go because it's very absolute. Opacity doesn't make a lot of sense with replace as an option. So you kind of want your opacity to be 100% if you're going to be replacing. The value, you can set it to anything you want. 50%, 100, and 0 are what I tend to use. I'll tend to paint 50% in the middle of a bend area for the two neighboring joints. I'll tend to paint 0 or 100% for something that is out of bounds for that bone that I don't want it to be affecting at all, or something that absolutely is its domain. Like down here, it would probably be a good thing to paint with replace 100% this end cap. I want to make sure that this end cap isn't deforming when I bend this arm. So painting on 100% just on that first row of vertices is a nice start, and it can give a point of comparison for the other parts that are a little bit more jello-like and inconsistent. Okay. Let's go ahead and check add. So what add will do is, in addition to whatever value it has, it will try to add this value. Now our skin weights are normalized, which means they won't go beyond 0 and 1, which is a good thing. But if you're adding value, it should probably be a small value. Okay, so I'm going to set this to 0.15. So every time I click my mouse and hold down, it's going to add 15% more influence. This is a good time to make your brush a little bit softer. Okay, but I'm going to add 15% more influence here, and you can see they just became white because whatever value they were, it was close enough that it just became 100%. Okay. You cannot take away with add. That would be scale. So if I'm scaling, and this is at 15%, I'm scaling it to 15% of whatever the value currently is. Okay, so if the value is 1 and I painted on here, it would be down to 15. You can see when I do these operations, I try to just go around once in a big loop to get them all roughly the same color. Okay. And with a softer brush, it's not exact all the time, but it's nice to do that. Those did not turn black. They turned dark blue. Scale tends to not hit the extreme edge as quickly, but if you do it over and over and over again, eventually you'll get close enough, or maybe you never will. Yeah, I'm not really getting close enough to 0 there. And so if I really wanted it to be 0, then I'd have to go to replace and choose a value of 0. And then I could paint it out entirely, but it's okay. Scale and add are the gentler ways to adjust your values. Finally, we have smooth. And what smooth will do is try to even out the value from its neighbors. So I don't know what the value is on this green band, but if we look at our color ramp, it's somewhere over here. It's less than 50% influence. Blue is very close to 0. Yellow is somewhere near 50%. So if I start to smooth this green band, it should turn cyan or so. And so it's a way to just kind of even out the rather broad distribution of values that's happening right now. And I could smooth out this dark blue area, and it gets a little bit more influence, but you can see the effect is no longer as chaotic and sudden. So that's a nice thing to do. And although my opacity is 100%, it's nice to lower this a bit when you're using smooth, because then it more gradually adjusts and isn't quite so violent. You can go over an area with smooth quite a number of times until it's very, very gradated and even. But normally it's a tool that you use after you've used some of the harsher ones. So in order of harshness, replace is the most harsh, add and scale are next. They just go in opposite directions, and then smooth is last in that order. Okay. So here's the basic approach that you want to try to follow. First, try to identify on each joint if it's affecting the right thing and how far its influence extends. And I try to work from the most core part of the hierarchy down to the limbs. So on joint 1, what is joint 1 affecting? Is it the right thing? And is it extending too far? So for instance, do I really want joint 1 to be affecting anything out here on this area? Not really. So I'm going to replace opacity 100% 0 and just drag along over here. I don't want it to affect that far along the mesh, really. And I need to use the other brush profile if I really want to be specific. There we go. So I get a nice band. I'll leave it affecting this much because this is still technically within that elbow. I don't know how much influence I want, but it's not 0. It's something a little bit greater than that. So then we go to joint 2. Joint 2 is affecting the elbow. What is it affecting? Well, right now I've already painted out the 2 caps and it's affecting everything else. That's fine. Is the gradient ramp correct right now? No, it isn't, but it's fine for the moment. And then joint 3 could either affect nothing and I could give the cap to joint 2, or it could affect the cap and fall off from there. But I know I don't want it to extend all the way down here, so it's been painted out. Okay, so far so good. So now we want to think, how do we want to adjust how much it's affecting things and where? Using add and scale typically. Or we could keep using replace. So I could reason to myself, all right, as this is affecting up to the joint, I want it to have 50% ownership of this joint area. So I could say replace value of 0.5 like that. And I could just paint that right on there, which tends to be kind of a green yellow. I'm just going to paint right in there. There we go. So that's 0.5. And I could do the same thing with joint 2. I could say joint 2, I want it to share responsibility, so I want it to be 0.5 right in there. There we go. And so it's kind of this greeny yellow kind of shape also. Then in order to smooth out the rest of it, I could either scale and add, or I could use smooth. Let's say scale, and I'm going to turn the value lower, because on joint 2, I don't want it to affect down here very much. that should be the domain of the first joint to keep this a little bit straighter and more cylinder-like. So there we go. I just scaled that down. Now, don't worry about this big harsh difference. We're going to affect that last. But we're in the right ballpark now, where this is moving very little, and this is changing shape a lot, and then it's got more influence over here. So I could also go to Add, and I'll just leave it at a low value and say I want to add more influence over here. Right? Don't worry if you misclick a little bit and you get uneven colors. That's what smooth is going to be for. So I've got a couple splotches of white. We'll use the smooth brush. So it's got this very sudden turning shape right now. Let's go back to joint 1. So it's got more influence here. It should have less influence over there. So I'll change it to scale. Say, yeah, I don't want you to have very much over there. So we're just going to scale it down a little bit. And then let's take a look at joint 3. Joint 3, I don't want joint 3 really to be doing anything beyond this cap. So I'll go to Replace, 0, and just paint all of this blue out. This is why the color is so helpful. I just want to get rid of everything that it's influencing through that bend area. Try to be a little bit careful. It's based on your camera angle and whether or not you can see this projected brush. Once you are clicking and dragging though, it tries to stick to the surface. So if you just wiggle your brush around a little bit, like right there, sometimes it'll get harder to reach vertices. So I'm just going to say you have no influence all the way up until here. Okay, so let's check joint 2, joint 1. All right. So this is a pretty harsh bend. Let me just test this bend right now. Right? It's looking extremely ugly, right? It's no longer squishing the cylindrical parts, but it's looking very, very ugly. So I'm going to bend this just a little bit less so I can see the vertices in here a bit easier, and return to my paint skin cluster paint weight tool. And we're going to use smooth. So I'm going to change it to a softer brush, smooth. We'll leave opacity at somewhere around 50% right now. And I'm going to start removing influence just a little bit, or kind of spreading it out, more the better way to think about it. First on the edges and then in the middle. So I'm just kind of evening out that distribution, and then I'm going to start evening it out in the middle like this. And any area that looks a little bit rougher, just, you know, click and drag over it more times, like that, to where it's less crazy. Just kind of calming that down a little bit. Over here as well, 50% might not be the distribution we want exactly. Okay. And so I'm going to go to joint 1 and do the same thing. I'm going to drag along this harsh transition and the yellow one. If you can hear, I'm clicking and dragging and letting go and clicking and dragging, because each operation only happens once. When you click and drag, it's going to apply these effects in the settings, and then it won't apply them repeatedly if you just click and drag and drag and drag and drag. So you have to let go, click and drag again. So it's a lot of click and drag, click and drag, click and drag. So just making that less harsh. So it's getting somewhat there. I don't want to cross over into the black or the white sections though, because then they'll start to share their influence at something, you know, less than 100% or greater than 0%. And we want to keep that clamped there. So I don't want to affect that. That's a place where selecting, see, I just did it there. You can undo. So just keep that in mind. That's where the selection part might come in. So here it is, nice and smooth and nice and even, but that still doesn't look great, right? I mean, it's smooth-ish, but it's still like pinching down in here. The outside actually looks fine. See that? So if this was a real mesh, if this was a limb, whatever side is the outside, and that would be like the knee or the elbow, then that part of it would probably be done with nothing more than a smooth gradient from one bone to the other. The inside, however, is not done. The inside usually requires a tighter control over how much influence the vertices have. And if that joint is able to rotate, then it's a little bit more important. Usually with these hinging joints, though, it's not in your shoulder, a ball and socket joint, it gets very complicated, which is why I'm demonstrating on this mesh. So let's try to fix this inseam. I'm going to right click, go back to paint, skin clusters. And what we need to do is maintain more influence closer to the crease for the first joint and lessen it after the crease. And the same thing, but opposite for joint 2. It needs to have more influence coming up to the crease from this direction and less down here. So we need our add and scale. So I'm going to go to add for joint 1. We're going to add a very small amount. So something like 5% or 10%. Let's do 10 at an opacity of 50%. So I'm going to just drag my brush through here until it looks like the right kind of shape. And then zoom in and probably shrink my brush a little and do it in this inseam as well. So you have to look and determine, is that the right shape yet? Nope. So I'm going to keep doing it. Keep doing it. And you can be mindful of the color. It's closer to this. That's a small pinch, but it's a reasonable pinch. Okay. And I'm going to try, I like to do it just with add, so I just switch to the other bone and do the same thing over here. So I'm going to add its influence on this inseam and try to add it on the sides a little bit. And I'm kind of avoiding that crease in the middle. You can see it starts to close over itself and get difficult to paint. So at that point, I would probably unbend the joint. So with your arm controllers, this would be the IK. Unbend the joint a bit like this, just so I can see those lines more easily. But look at this. It's already quite a bit better on that side. Now, it's going to not really positively affect it if you bend it the opposite way, but it's going to make this direction look better and better. So I'm going to unbend it just a bit and then reactivate my tool. And now I'm going to use the smooth brush at a fairly low opacity right in this center. Shrink the brush just right in this center line. So this yellowish is probably correct where it's like shearing, but you get these little pockets where it's a bit too harsh, and I just kind of go around and dab at those to lessen the harshness of that transition. So something like this is probably better. I can see that this is more red than this portion up here, which is a bit odd. And so if I see, no, that's correct. It should be a little bit more. This one needs influence. It's because it's sharing with the cap up here. So if I smooth here, what color does this turn? Oranger, lighter. It's getting more influence. Or no, it's sharing at like 50%. Well, because it's so this is one argument for never using the cap. You don't ever have to use the end bone for anything. I could just add all that influence to joint number 2 and have joint number 3 do nothing. So your fingertips is a place to consider that. Let's do that just because it's confusing. I'm going to replace 100% with a harsher brush for joint 2, just like this. And so joint 3 is going to have nothing, but it's fine. There we go. I'm going to paint all that in. Just going to make the control of this shape a little bit easier. So now if I switch to joint 3, what actually does still have a bit, so I could paint 0, replace value 0. Hopefully that influence goes to the correct bone. If it doesn't, the smooth tools will fix it out. Once you hit 0, then it shouldn't be included when you're smoothing weights anymore. Okay, so here we are. And now I'm going to choose the smooth brush at a low enough opacity. And I'll smooth a little bit. But then the question is, okay, well, if that's less than 100%, where is that value going? It's probably going to joint 3. Nope. Going to joint 2. Or sorry, joint 1. Interesting. So try to be aware of that. So this is slightly less than 100%, which means that joint is controlling it a tiny bit. But that's okay because look how it's nice and smooth now. So let's keep using smooth. I'll do one little adjustment here just to get that color even all the way around. Okay. And then down here, looks all right. I'd say that's probably about as good as you're going to get with this simple example. So we've got a nice kind of pinch. Yes, they will start intercolliding and overlapping down here. Don't worry about it too much. It's simple geometry. It's low poly geometry. If you close it all the way like this, does it look like how an elbow should look? There's a big cleft. There's sort of a bulge on either side. There's a roundness on the back. That's about as good as you're going to expect with a simple tube-like joint. Okay? If we bend it the opposite way, what do we get? A much uglier pinch with a much longer taper and a harsher roundness on the back. That's because it's designed now to bend in this direction, not the opposite one. Okay? So that's sort of the task that we're going about doing for the whole body. We're trying to examine each one of the joint bending areas, so like the torso, legs, arms, fingers, and the feet, and to make sure that the bones are affecting the right part in the right way. There are errors that can occur, though. If you, let's go back to paint, skin cluster. If you remove influence from too many things at once, then the vertice has nowhere to go, and it will oftentimes just zap itself all the way down to 0, 0, 0 on the grid. So I'm going to try to create that error now with this cap. We're going to use replace 0 at 100% opacity for all 3 bones. So we've got 0 here for joint 3. I'm going to say 0 there. It's already happening. It's actually jumping to bind pose is what it's doing. And then we've got 0 for here. So if you get this kind of error when you're painting and vertices jump way over somewhere that makes no sense, just know that it's because those vertices don't have a home to go to now. So there's an easy way to fix this. I'm going to bend and unbend just so you can see. At bind pose, it would look normal. This is why we have to distend the skeleton and use our controllers. So I'm just going to bend it over here. Instead of selecting object, when I do this fix, I'm going to select vertex and encircle these vertices, which are the error, so the ones that are jumped up here. So when I do that, you can right click and hold paint, skin cluster, and now I'm only affecting these vertices. So it's like you went to the select or the paint select mode. It's just a little bit more direct, and I like to do it in edit mode instead. We do have a flood button down here. The flood button will apply whatever the effect is to everything that is selected, so be careful with it. Flood is safest to use when you do what I just did, which is grab a small section of vertices. But you can also affect large areas with smooth. You can flood smooth if you're absolutely sure. So sometimes it's okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to flood replace influence on the correct bone. So in this case, it should be joint 2 is the correct bone. We're going to flood replace 100%. Okay, and I should just click like that, and there we go. It's back in place now. Now remember that we have to deselect, go back to object mode before we continue painting. Okay, but now we've solved that little error. Every now and then that's going to happen, mostly when you're removing influences. So if you want to be safer, try to stick to adding or the replacement that is not 0. And you shouldn't get that error very often, but if you're removing influence, you can get that error more. Also, slight problem with remove as just kind of a like scaling or replacing at 0 is that sometimes you don't know which other bone is going to pick up that influence. Sometimes none in that case, or sometimes one across the body that makes no sense. Like if there was a little bit of influence, let's say on joint 1, I'm going to give this a value of 194 or whatever, and this was sharing with joint 3 like that. If I removed, replace at 0 or scaled down, then I would think, oh, it should be sharing with joint 2, but what's going on here? It's a different color, and it turns out the wrong bone has some influence. So now I've removed on both of them. This one's 100% luckily, but sometimes it isn't. It just is partial, like 80%, 90%, and it doesn't get that 100%. So it's sometimes more beneficial to think about what influence are you going to add rather than take away. You can get more predictable results. Okay, so there you go. That's the kind of general philosophy and mechanics behind doing paint weights. You can sort of just start, if you're confident enough, from that explanation, but I'm also going to go through with our actual mesh and do a basic pass, at least to start it out, and do, let's say, one arm and hand, and some of those detached geometries, okay? But that's the basic mechanics of the thing. Here are the joints. We can select them, we can paint on them using our various modes and brush profiles, right? You can use these select and paint select modes if you need to. And because we have a rigged character, we should be using the controllers. But if you were just using the skeleton, then we can go to skin, go to bind pose. Last thing to mention before I switch over to the full rig is that you can do this the skin binding before you have any controllers on your skeleton, which is why we have this bind pose setting. Or you can do it after you have the controllers. It's really either way. I'm teaching you to do it after we have all the controllers so that we don't have to directly grab the skeleton, but some people prefer to do it that way. All right, so now I'm going to switch over to our full rig. All right, so we're back in our rig file with all of our controls. And first things first, this is now the skinning phase. So you should change the name of your file to skinning instead of controls or mesh or bones or whatever you had before. And when you increment, now it'll be skinning 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Okay. I'm going to make sure that we're seeing the right thing. So I've got my controls. They're all visible. I kind of need them to be visible because that's how I'm going to be distorting the character. Our bones layer, you can turn it off, but I think it's much better to see it, to have it visible in the scene so that you can see what it's relative to. And our geometry layer needs to now be interactable. So you're not going to be doing any drag select around this character now. You've got to be careful about what you're picking. And since we have detached meshes, we can handle these one at a time, and we sort of have to. We don't want to bind them all at once. So let me give you an example really quick. Up in the head, there's a number of different geometries. I'm going to show the outliner and close my tool menu just for a moment. And let's open up our geometry. We've got the eyes, we've got the head itself, and we've got the hair, the top teeth, the bottom teeth. And all of those need to be bound slightly differently. So it would be a good thing to get that out of the way so this works properly. Remember that when you're binding, this needs to be in bind pose. So don't change any of the controllers yet. Bind them first and then check to see if they're in the correct position. So let's grab eyeball left, this bone here. Oh, I named them opposite. Well, that's good to know. Tell you what, I'll redo that right now. IR, it gives it a 1 because I already have an IR. IL, so now I can get rid of that 1. So that was good to just check because that could have been confusing. So we've got IR and bone R. So I just shift selected that. So I've got only that joint and only this geometry. And I'm going to come up to skin, bind skin, but I'm going to go into the option box. And instead of joint hierarchy, as we kind of discussed, selected joints. Okay. Since it's only one joint and only this mesh, it should get 100% influence, and that's all. We'll hit apply. And then let's check that. So if we click on this mesh, let me move that aside. Tools options. Hit F to frame. And now I'm going to right click, paint, skin cluster. There we go. We've got one bone and it's completely white. If we go inside the head, we can see that. And the other way to check would be to move this controller around and see if that eyeball tracks it perfectly. It's really hard to see from this distance, so let's get it a bit closer. A lot closer. There we go. So it should just look right at that controller. There we go. Okay. As long as we don't select that eyeball when we're doing any other skinning, it should never take on any other influences, so we're all set. Let's do that for each of the meshes for the face. So we're going to have this mesh. I'm going to hit Q to get that manipulator out of the way. And this bone. I've still got the window open to select a joint, so I'm going to hit apply. Everything's back in its default position now. Teeth, same thing. So I want the top teeth mesh. Come on. Top teeth. I want to be able to see them. Top teeth, there they are, to be bound to the head bone. So this one down here, we could make it the scalp if you really want, but the head bone, this one is going to be fine. If you're not sure about what joints you have selected, hit Shift and open up your hierarchy. They're the light blue ones. The dark blue ones are just a part of the rest of the hierarchy, but the light blue one is the only one I have selected. So if I did want to bind it to several, then hold down Control and click the subsequent ones, but I want teeth top and head bone, okay? Because when the jaw moves, I don't want the top teeth to move. But this is what basically has control over everything, except for that bone, which I guess you could put a hat on, or we could attach the hair to if we really want to. Maybe easier to see that way. So let's go ahead and bind that to selected joints as well. The bottom teeth should also be rigid, right? They're not going to squish. So we're going to give them to the chin. We could give it to jaw rotate, but I'm just going to give them to the chin. Okay, there we go. Chin, teeth bottom. And again, I'm going to hit apply. And the scalp, technically the hair, I guess, no, the hair is not entirely rigid. So in this case, I'm going to select several bones for the hair, because when the character is chewing or rotating its head, the hairline might move or the sideburns might move a little bit. So the hair can be selected to the head, to maybe even the neck a little bit, to the skull, unless that's confusing for some reason, and maybe even to the jaw rotate just a little bit. But it doesn't need to be attached to the rest of the skeleton. There's a lot of skeleton down there. And we definitely don't want it attached to the eyes. Okay. So with those selected, I've got the hair geometry, and I selected all of those one by one. Then I'm going to hit apply there as well. And that's enough to play with for the moment. So let's see what happens when I start rotating things. So the jaw now, you can see the teeth are moving. Now the head skin is not moving yet, right? That's fine. The hair is wobbling around, which is funny and not really what we want. So let's zero that controller back. When we move the eyes, I'm going to get them closer so that we can see a little bit better. When we move the eye controllers, you can see the eye meshes are moving around and bones, but nothing else, which is good. So I'm going to zero those back out again. When I move the head, so what's going to happen there? The hair and the eyes and the teeth move, but the skin for the head doesn't. Okay, so it's just the things we bound. And if we had a tongue, then we'd have to worry about that too. So I'm going to zero that out. Okay. Now, obviously, some of that was a little bit incorrect, like where I'm starting to rotate the jaw and the hair is moving. We don't really want that. I just included it so that I could have slight adjustments here in the sideburns or something. So there's going to be some paint weighting necessary up there. Let's do the mesh of the head itself. And again, I probably don't want to bind to the entire skeleton. I just want the joints that are going to be relevant. So let's start with the obvious one. We definitely want the head. I'm holding down Control and selecting in the outliner. So we definitely want the head bone. Okay. The skull bone, probably, because we're going to share that between like this joint and what's completely rigid up here. The jaw, yes, because the jaw is included. The chin, yes. The neck, yes. Okay. And one of the spines here. Okay. So we probably need spine 1 at the very least. Now here's the question. Are we going to include the clavicles? Let's take a look at the mesh. Well, there's some skin down there. in the area where the clavicle has influence, when this shrugs, the shirt will be moving. Do we need the skin down here to move too? The safe answer is yes. The safe answer is include it. Because if this moves in some way and then that skin pokes through, we'll never have the opportunity to fix it. So let's include clavicle L and clavicle R. We don't need to include the shoulder. That's all the way out here, and it has influence down the chain. Okay, so we don't need that. But we do have this joint and the two clavicles, and that should be enough. So just to review what it is we've selected, this spine down to here, which is well beyond where the mesh stops, but it's enough to hold it in this position. The two clavicles, the neck, head, and skull. The jaw rotate and chin, but not the eyeball bones. So here you can see I, L, and R are not selected. Okay. Skin, bind skin option box, and make sure that we've got selected joints. We can hit apply. Okay. As long as everything was in its bind pose, then we should be fine there. Now when I rotate, it's going to look a lot more normal. Okay. The collar is not moving or anything yet, but that's okay. If I move the shoulder, we see a little bit of jittering in the bottom skin of the neck. We may remove some of that. We may add more. Not really sure yet. And if we move this, of course, we're moving everything else down chain so we can see it. And the chest currently doesn't have any skinning, so we don't see what happens there. We want to zero out all of these controllers. Be very careful about that. When you play with this, zero them out before you bind anything else. It's fine once everything is bound to just be messing around with stuff, but we want to make sure all the controllers are in their default position before we bind new things. Okay. There we go. So everything's back to normal. So I recommend going through and binding everything first before you start painting. That way you don't run the risk of having the skeleton in a non-bind pose. But you can see this is working rather nicely by default. Okay, not too bad. Some little weird things here and there. And then if I move the jaw, okay, that one's the nightmare one, where what's happening is that there's nothing to tell the jaw what is lower or upper skin. And so the whole face just distends. So that's a big one where we need custom painting, where we open the jaw bones once we're painting, and we remove the influence from the top and give it to the skull, and we add more influence to the bottom so that it opens the bottom chin and leaves the top alone, essentially. But it's a delicate operation. So let's put that back to 0. This one, and just check that everything is back in its bind pose. Okay, so let's bind everything else before we get into too much trouble here. And binding stuff is pretty quick, and so this could be your entire first step. You don't really have to worry about saving over and over. If it's a little confusing, then go ahead and just hit the save button a couple times, but it's usually pretty fast. Okay, the arms. Again, I'm going to look inside to remind myself how far they go inside the chest, but the arms are this standalone mesh. So we can select the whole hierarchy from clavicle down on both sides. Okay, so I'm going to shift select. Let's see. There's a bunch of constraints in there. I've got the hierarchy open, but I'm going to start at clavicle L and come down. So there's clavicle R. I'm going to come all the way down to the last thumb and shift select. So that gets everything in that hierarchy. I'm just going to remove the constraints because I think that's going to be faster. And the effectors. So just anything that isn't a bone, I'm going to control click. Okay. Good. I'm just checking everything. Yeah, it goes down to pelvis. All right, so we've got the clavicle and shoulders for everything. We don't really need this spine piece because when I shift select the mesh, you can see it doesn't go anywhere near that. Okay, we don't need anything else. In fact, we almost don't need clavicle influence at all, but I'm just going to leave it in there. A little too much is no problem. Okay, so now I'm going to come up to skin Unbind Skin, 2 selected joints, apply. Okay. And then test to make sure that it worked the way that I wanted it to. So if I move this arm controller, yeah, it's bending and moving the arm. If I shrug the shoulder, we see a reaction, but not in the t-shirt. Okay. And the fingers are going to be the tricky part when you first bind the fingers. See, they kind of squish and stretch to each other. There's ways in the bind step to avoid this. Heat mapping would be the best one, and closest in hierarchy rather than distance is another. But it'll be pretty fast for us to fix this, so don't worry about it. Okay, let's go ahead and zero all that out again. So we're going to zero the shoulder, zero the pull vector if you move that, wrist controller, and any of the bend handles and the first joint. Okay. There we go. So we're coming around to a fully working mesh. So let's go to the primary body. So the primary body we combined with a lot of different pieces. This is the only one where I might just bind to the whole skeleton just because there's so much here. But if you want to save yourself a little bit of headache, then excluding, for instance, anything below the forearm bone gets rid of all of these bones in the finger and make sure that there's no possibility of error there. But with the feet and up near the neck and head, we might be including everything here. So let's start. I'm going to select the root bone and then spine, neck, head. I think we can stop at head because the collar shouldn't really move very much if the skull itself is rotating around. So I'm going to stop there. So no skull or jaw or chin or eyes. Clavicle, shoulder, elbow, 4. And I'm going to stop there because we're already out of the short sleeve area. In fact, I'm not even going to include 4. I'm going to just do elbow. So then let's come down to the other arm. Clavicle, shoulder, elbow. So I'm holding control while I'm in the outliner. Just select all those. Let's go down past all these fingers. Pelvis, hips, knee, ankle. Do we want the ball of the foot? I think we do, just to be safe. There's a chance that the ball of the foot will affect, well, because it bends this area, it might affect the front hem of the pant just a little bit, but not toe. And then opposite side over here, we see hip, knee, ankle, ball, and that should be it, plus the mesh. So just to visually check, I've got root, spine, neck, head, skipping the skull, clavicle, shoulder, elbow, no fingers, clavicle, shoulder, elbow, no fingers or forearm, pelvis, hip, knee, ankle, ball, hip, knee, ankle, ball. That should be it. Let's go ahead and skin, selected joints. Okay. And then before I test that one, I'm just going to do the shoes because it's the last bit. So you can see how now, since we're selecting joints, if you had these as 2 separate meshes, you just bind this one to these bones, that one to those bones. But since we've got them both, and we want to select both sets of bones. So here I've got ankle, ball, toe. Now the question is, do I want to select knee to have some stretch in the shoe? Well, the shoe is pretty rigid, and in fact, we've got a hem covering it up. But just to be safe, I'm going to include the knee because I'm paranoid that somehow the mesh will interpenetrate and I'll have to rebind the entire thing. And then on the opposite side, so we'll do knee, ankle, ball, toe. For both of those meshes, I already have the mesh selected. Selected joints, apply. And that should be all of the meshes. Let's see, body, and you can tell it's bound because the skeleton changes color. Teeth, bottom, yep, we already did that. Top, hair, arms, shoes, belt loops. Okay, we didn't include belt loops. This one's going to be a pain. Do the paint weighting for the belt area before you do the belt loops. And whatever influence you give the belt, I strongly recommend you just give the belt like 100% influence on the root bone so that it doesn't really flex unless the root bone rotates and the rest of the things flex. Give it to these as well, and they should match. But yeah, I forgot about the belt loops. That one's going to be a pain. You probably should share the influence, though, at least between root, first spine, pelvis, and the two hips, just in case. I'll guarantee you that one's going to be the pain, so leave that one for last. So let's do root, spine, come down to pelvis, hip L, and hip R. And then hit apply. Okay, that should be it now. Belt loops, head. Yep, we did. And the two eyes. Okay, so we should be able to close the outliner at that point and just test. Now, with default skinning, the character actually works at this point. It's not like it's going to be broken or anything. In fact, let me set the geometry to render, the bones to off. The character will flex and move and bend and be generally correct. But there will be small things that could be better here and there. Mostly in complicated areas like elbows and shoulders and the hips. You can see that is very ugly in the elbow bend. We need to give more influence to the upper arm so that it can hold that bicep shape for longer. And we're getting a really ugly pinch and kind of a wiggly pinch over here. The hip area, I don't really know what the belt loops and belt are going to do. Right now they're decent. They're a little squishy, like a belt really shouldn't be squishy, but they're not bad. Let's see what happens when I bend the leg. The knee area is fine in the front and poor in the back. The butt area, unfortunately, is completely disappearing. The butt is going to give you some challenge, by the way, because you have to hold the shape for so long out here. It almost carves out the shape of two butt cheeks when you do the paint weighting. And what happens in between the legs here is going to give you trouble because the crotch area needs to stretch, but each thigh needs to hold to its own side. So you can see how crazily I'm moving these controllers. This is essentially the way you control them when you're doing your paint weighting so that there's no doubt that this is stretching or not. I didn't hide my locator. So if you're drag selecting right now, there's the chance of grabbing the IK handles and the locators. At this point, if you have this DNT group, turn its visibility off so that there's no chance of accidentally grabbing that. Okay. So what I've got here is my geometry is set to render momentarily. My bones are turned off and my controllers are the only thing visible. So I should be able to grab everything and zero their translates and rotates to come back to my default pose. If you do that and something crazy happens, undo. If that doesn't do it, reopen the file. Okay? Don't mess around with that and take a risk. That's a very bad, risky thing to do. Okay? Okay, just checking everything. So yeah, in general, it's all going to work pretty much correctly at this point. Even ball roll, you can kind of see that functioning correctly. Okay, a little bit too squishy though, and very, very tight in there. So yeah, that's the stage we're going to be at, and we're going to go ahead and show our bones layer, unrender our geometry, so that we're going to be able to interact with everything. And I'm just going to save one more time on this first guy skinning step, and then increment that save. Okay, and so now we're on, oh, it didn't do it. No changes to, oh yeah, okay. You have to sometimes change something, like I'll just zero this back. And now I'll click increment and save. All right, let's take a look at the chest. We want to select it, paint, skin cluster, and then we can close the outliner and open the tool settings. Okay, to see what's going on in here. Now my brush, first of all, is very, very small. So I'm going to hold down B and left click and drag to get it about the right size. Something like this makes sense because I can see relatively small areas in here. I might have to shrink it when we're dealing with the armpit. Now, first, I didn't move the controllers at all, just for this first look. I just want to see how things are distributed. Generally, they're going to be fairly symmetrical. There are options down in stroke for enabling screen projection and reflection. Don't do that. And in general, only work on one side of the body because we can reflect these paint weights up here in skinning. We can mirror the skin weights from one side to the other. So you don't have to do the same work twice. So in general, like the armpit and shoulder area are going to be a little bit more complicated. And then we can just mirror those skin weights over. The mirroring can cause some issues occasionally, but as long as you do it early, and then if you fine tune after that, then you're probably going to be fine. Okay. So let's look through what we've got here. So we've got pelvis down here. We're not going to deal with all that just yet. So I'm going to scroll up to spine 1. We can see spine 1 is influencing quite a bit below like the belt level. And we don't really want that to happen. So that's a good candidate for removing. So spine 2 is fine. It's behaving itself. Let's see, where's clavicle? Okay. And we're not really going to see the effect of a lot of this until we start rotating different parts of the body. But it sort of makes sense. The color is the thing I want to keep my eye on because it's this extra piece of geometry that's over the other. And it's kind of got to match the underlying vertices. Otherwise, it's going to interpenetrate and be really weird. So, see, here's the neck. Yeah. So we want to watch the neck skin and the shoulder all in that area. It's going to be a little bit more complicated. Head influence, probably going to remove from most of this. So let's start at least doing replace value 0 for some of these. So replace value 0. Oh, and remember the brush profile, when you're doing at least the replace operation with 100% and 0%, that's going to be more important to change the brush to a more solid one. So I'm just going to bring it down to that range right there, and I'll leave it at that for the moment. The neck influence, you never quite know. This big ring that runs around the head, I think, is the reasonable one, but down the sleeves is not. So I'm going to remove the sleeves, probably that one too. And since this is a fairly low poly mesh, I'm just going to do it by hand, going back and forth. Okay, let's get rid of that one too. We don't need that. Okay, just checking which ones I removed on the opposite side. And then just sneak it in here to get that one out of there. So we've got a little bit of influence around there. Okay, we've got elbow, shoulder, clavicle. Shoulder, elbow. That's fine. I mean, the elbow can have a little tiny influence in the sleeve. That's probably too much as I'm looking at it, but it's okay. Let's go ahead and move the controllers though, so we can see what's actually going to be going on. So first, what I'll oftentimes do is just bend the body off to one side, kind of like that, and then the arm that's available, do something to the shoulder and hand controllers so I can see the influence taking place. So for instance, like bend it like this a bit, and then let's raise the elbow up over here and raise up the shoulder a bit so it pinches that area so we can kind of see in the armpit. The armpit actually looks pretty good. Usually the armpit is a big problem, but it's not looking that bad. Okay, so there is a little bit. See, as you move it around and the whole chest is kind of warping, that's the thing that we want to avoid. The arm moving around should not warp the chest out like that. It should only be affecting kind of the armpit area, sort of the area where the pec muscle would be and where the latissimus would be, but not the entire rib cage kind of zone there. Okay, so this will be a good enough position to do a little bit of arm work and also sleeve. Let me see here. So I'm going to go ahead and get the paint skin clusters and come back down in the list here. Okay. So spine has a lot of low influence in this area, which it should probably have more. And then clavicle L has probably too much influence. So let's do some like lower value adding. So I'm going to add something like 15. You can even turn the opacity down if you want to add less. Although at that point, maybe just turn the number down. Let's add like 10. Let's see. So I'm going to give this spine more influence over the lower part of the armpit in here. There we go. Just trying to turn it the same relative color. And a little bit more on the under part of the sleeve area. And remember that this is sloppy at first, and then you use the smooth brush after that to get it a lot nicer. Okay. All right, so adding a little bit of influence there. Let's see, spine 1, do I want to do anything with that? I could remove spine 1 influence on this sleeve at least. So let's do replace 0. Spine 1 really has no business being involved all the way up here. Keep in mind that there are these vertices in the inside of the sleeve as well. So try to grab those. I'm going to remove. And just try to pick a reasonable spot to stop, such as like right around that ring there. Okay, spine 1, remember, is all the way down here. So it's extending up quite a ways, but that's the only part that I definitely want to say don't influence at all. Actually, up here in the collar as well. So yeah, let's get rid of this whole ring across the top chest. And if there's anything along the back here as well. There we go. So that'll keep it a little bit better under control there. Always the chance that you miss something. All right, so spine 2. I sort of don't want spine 2 even to have influence down the sleeve. We can let clavicle affect it a little bit, or shoulder, but I don't really think it has any business being over here either. So the fewer bones that have influence, the easier it is to balance their deformations, but also the harsher their bend and deformation becomes. So I am going to remove spine 1 and 2 from these areas and try to give that influence to something that will make better use of it. But just know that that could make the deformation a little bit harsh in appearance at first. There we go. Okay, so just one ring where it's zeroed out there, where it's not going to share. And then that should mean that clavicle has a much greater stake in what happens there. Then we've got shoulder L. Now, shoulder L is the one that deserves having most of this influence. Elbow, I'm going to reduce elbow eventually. Let's get rid of the elbow influence just on this one ring to keep it nice and clean. But I'm going to leave the rest of that blue there so it can somehow figure out how to slightly affect the end of the sleeve. And yeah, we didn't include forearm, so that's fine. All right, so far so good there. So then, as I mentioned, shoulder is the one that needs most of this influence. So I can see the colors are indicating something around like 75 to 80%. I think 80 is a good number. I'm going to say replace 80 just to start out. So 0.8 with 100% opacity hard brush. And I'm just going to paint right in here to say that one, at least I know how much influence it's got. And we could use softer brushes from then on. I'm going to do 2 of them. When I start softening this out, it'll make more sense. Okay, so both of those rings right now have 80% influence. I don't know what's going on up here, but it's going to be slightly less because I want it to move just a little bit when the elbow is bending. Okay, clavicle. This is the tough one because this is the area where everything's very pinchy and where I may want to just select vertices. In fact, I think right now it's a good idea for me to select the vertices I think you can also select faces. Let's find out. I think you can select faces as a different method, which also counts. So I'm going to select faces all the way around. There we go. Just double click to get that ring. And then it's a little hard to see, but I want to grab the faces that are underneath there as well. We could, no, it's the same object. I was going to say turn off the visibility. Sometimes I'll go inside the mesh to look out, but we've got too many overlapping meshes. Okay, so I'm going to grow my selection. Shift period. So you can see that it selects the adjacent attached faces. So now we've got these faces on the t-shirt as well. And that'll be fine as a place to start. So I'm going to right click, paint, skin cluster, there we go. And come up to spine to clavicle, shoulder, and figure out which one of these should be the one that that should affect the collar the most. There's probably going to be a couple. So neck is an obvious one that probably needs some influence. Since I selected those faces, I'm just going to test real quick if I can flood. So I'm going to say replace at, right now it's like 80%. Let's just flood. And it didn't do it. So I might have been wrong about what you can select. Opacity 100%, value 80, replace. It should have done it. So it didn't do it. I guess we got to use vertices. So down here, I can see weirdly they're still selected. If I go right click, choose face. Okay, I think they're still selected. I believe it's control click to vertices, All right, I got vertex selection from that face selection. So now it should be able to use it, paint, skin cluster, weights. There we go. Okay, so now on the neck, if I hit flood, so now the whole collar area has 80% influence from the neck. Is that correct? Probably not, but I just wanted to test that would work, and it does. Really, the neck muscle itself is probably not that influenced by this, but it's going to be a good place to start. Let's do 50%. Got to start somewhere. Okay, so the whole collar area is 50% influenced by the neck bone. The head bone, I have the ability for it to be affected, but I want it to be pretty low. I want that to be nothing. Okay, so let's do replace 0. I don't want the head affecting anything other than like maybe the final ring of the collar. I'm just going around dragging. Brush is maybe just a little too big for this, but it's okay. And we'll see if I move the head around and the collar's jiggling around too much, then I'll undo that. I'm going to reduce the size of my brush just a little. I'm also going to choose smooth just to put influence back in that last ring and sort of even out how much influence it's got. If it's a uniform color, then it's likely a uniform influence. Okay, so that's fine. For the head, for the neck, it's a lot more yellow. The neck really shouldn't be influencing this far down, but now I've got to have it distribute between the clavicles because that's the next, or the shoulders. So that's the wrong side. I'm trying to stick to the left side. So there's the shoulder itself, which is not the right one. It's hard to think about sometimes, but like if the shoulder joint gets closer and further away, we want it to do something. That's this bone, that's the clavicle. But if this bone rotates, that's this part of the arm. We don't want anything to happen in the collar as a result of that. So let's replace at 0 for that. The reason I'm not painting more is because I want it to be a gradual change most of the time, where using the smooth brush is going to do most of the heavy lifting. You know, I'm actually looking at the shoulder all the way having influence down here doesn't make much sense either. So I'm going to paint out. Oh, I don't have it selected right now. That's right. Initially, I selected these, so I have to concentrate up here, but that would be on the list of things to do also. I don't want the shoulder affecting that down there. That would be the clavicle instead. Okay. Elbow, yeah, it shouldn't have any influence. Clavicle should. That's the one. So what do I got here? So I've got very low influence, but yeah, it should sort of match the whatever's happening in the chest here. It looks like it's something like a third, so like 0.3. I'm going to leave this on replace and just point in, or just paint in 0.3 on the lower part of the collar and on any mesh that's immediately there to try to match them. And yeah, I'll just extend it all the way back to the center for the moment, even though that's wrong, just so I have something to smooth out. Okay, and I probably, yeah, I'll do it on here as well. Okay, did I do it too high? No, I didn't do it too high. Okay, so now I'm going to smooth. Remove that just a bit. Okay, and on the front, it already sort of was smoothed out, but that's fine. Okay, so now the clavicle is affecting this area, but then this is much higher up, and I think that's because of the shoulder joint, and I would have to undo my selection so I can paint more freely. So let's go ahead and let's do that now. Go back to just the entire mesh. Actually, I want to see how it moves first. Let's see. So here's the shoulder. Sometimes wireframe unshaded is going to be helpful. X-ray joints, do I really need that at this point? Let's turn that off because I think that happens anyway when you do weight painting. Wireframe unshaded. Okay. Question is that moving the collar too much? Probably not. It's just very, very harsh right now. It might be moving too much with the neck influence, actually. So when the neck moves and rotates, do I want the whole collar to rotate? No, I want it to stay still. And the neck should distribute that rotation up the mesh. So I'm going to rotate the neck away like that and start doing some editing with that as well, because that's definitely wrong. Okay, yeah, we see we can still see the joints when we're painting our weights, even though we don't have X-ray shaded on. So that's fine. Okay. So yeah, neck. Neck should not have that much influence. It should be a lot less. So let's bring this down to like what we did earlier. It was like a third. So we'll do, oops, that's opacity. There we go, 100% third. So I'm going to go ahead and replace, yeah, there we go. At most a third. I guess I'll just, it's the neck, so I'll just paint all the way around that and underneath there. Okay. And then less as it goes further away. Just painting the entire collar. There we go. Keep going. Couple spots I missed there. Okay, so then what should be influencing this part, this central part, is more like this bone, so spine 2. So this is where we have to like start adding. I'm going to start adding like 10%, especially in the middle. Yeah, just up until it turns yellow, which is about like 50%. Okay. And especially in the rear center as well, where the clavicles are exchanging, it should have more. That's probably too much I just added there. So this is what takes so long in paint weighting. It's not complicated. really. It's just laborious and it's fiddly. You have to go round and round and round, trying things, moving them, seeing if they look right, rethinking it, and it ends up taking a while. Okay, so then clavicle. Luckily, only having to do one side, so I'm still on add right now. Only having to do one side at a time, and then mirroring it is a huge help. I'll see how well this this mesh accepts mirroring in just a moment. So I'm just adding a bit of influence to the clavicle to the dead center there, and a bit to these, because it should move all of this meat away and towards. This is sort of the scapula area, and it's going to share its influence across the center with that center bone and with the other scapula, with the other clavicle. So I'm going to add a little bit of influence, at least until it's like pale green, something like that. And then, of course, the smooth brush is going to have to do a lot of work here too. In fact, let's do a little bit right now, just to get the harshness out of that. But it'll kind of be down to testing it and, you know, rotating it around and seeing what happens. There we go. Just trying to even it all out a little bit. Okay. So the shoulder has, yeah, it has significantly less down. I do want to make sure that's none on some of these little areas, like right here. And as I was mentioning earlier, it's really weird for it to have influence all the way down here, or here, or here. Really, none of that. Okay, it's just that bone. It doesn't need this kind of influence. Just like a big spot that looks very strange there. Okay, so now I'd probably smooth instead of remove, so that although the influence is low, it's not completely zero. Just sharing it with whatever it's neighboring. Yeah, there we go. And I don't know how correct any of this is up here, but at least it's in the right area. Oops. Got a little, let me undo. There we go. Stay right here. Oh, I see why that is. Yeah, that's probably, it was correct before when it had like none. So let's do replace one more time. That should be none right there, which means that smoothing should happen here instead. It's just a little hard to tell. Okay. Fine. And you can see the skin of the arm kind of coming in through here. That's why it's easier to have single meshes than to have multiple meshes sometimes, because balancing of these paint weights can be delicate, but also it's kind of convenient to just have one shell to work on at a time without everything highlighting constantly. It's sort of up to preference, really. Okay. Let's see how well this accepts mirroring, because it's very different left and right at the moment. So I'm going to turn the bones and geometry just off so I can grab all the controllers, zero them. Let's turn those back on. And just do a check to make sure everything went back to its correct position. I want to make sure that we're sort of in bind pose for our mirroring. And I didn't do anything with fingers, so we should be good. Okay, so we're going to mirror from the left side to the right side. I'm going to save before I do this. Always a good idea. All right, so we're going to come up to skin, mirror skin weights, and we're mirroring across which axis? So the YZ axis, just like we were doing with bones. Direction, positive to negative or negative to positive. So what we want to do, so here's the YZ axis, X is facing this way, so that should be positive. But here's how we can check, just if we're paranoid. Just make a sphere, a cube, or whatever, move it that way. Is it a positive number? That's the positive side. So I'm going from positive to negative. So from the influences over here to the influences over here. I'm going to grab the appropriate mesh. There it is. From positive to negative across the correct axis. Now, surface associations. Closest point on surface. Raycast, I don't even know what that one means. Closest component. Closest component, I think, is if we had many more objects involved. And then influence association number 1 and 2. So this is the part where we can affect to make this a little bit more predictable. 1-to-1 should rely on the mirroring of the skeleton. Closest joint is sort of like if you mirror it across, it will find a joint. It shouldn't matter which one we pick there because they are mirrored correctly. And then label. Remember how we labeled everything with the same name and then an L or R prefix? That was going to help here as well. So we'll do closest and label. So if there's any discrepancy, there shouldn't be. It'll go by the label second. Normalize means, should we keep it between 0 and 1? Yes, we should. Okay, so we're going to mirror. Nothing should move, hopefully. But now if I shrug this side, the opposite side should shrug the same way with those bones over there. If I move the arm, and I get this kind of bend, this arm should move and bend the same kind of way. And hopefully the center part of the spine behaves itself because we chose normalize and doesn't look asymmetric or weird or anything like that. Okay. So you can mirror regularly if you want. You can wait until you have a lot of work done. I probably wouldn't. I'd probably do it more regularly. I hate that vertice. I don't know why it's doing that. But you can see how it's basically working. I still have too much influence on the neck in the center, but you can see that it's a symmetrical influence now that I've mirrored. And if I move the head, what happens? That's far, far too bendy. The twist is nice, but it's probably got too much influence down the neck as well. I think the head influence is going to have to diminish to about 0 by this point, and so I'll keep that in mind. But you can see how that worked. Okay. Let's move on. I said I was going to do parts of the t-shirt just to show you, and also the arm and the jaw. Let's do the arm real quick. We'll just handle this elbow, and I'll show you the... Well, you know what? We did an elbow in our example before. I think you can figure that out. Let's do the fingers, because that's the part that's going to cause a headache. So here, I'm going to drastically rotate the fingers like this. So the middle is left in its place, the pointer is rotated downward, ring is up, and pinky is left in its position. Actually, I'm going to rotate the pinky out and away. So kind of breaking the fingers apart. That's because this is going to help me to see them distinctly. It also gets them away from each other visually just so I can grab around things so that I can properly get their paint weights to affect only the finger I want to. I'm not going to select any vertices to flood fill, though. I don't think it's necessary. Well, you know what I'm saying that? Well, at this stage, it's just going to be hard to do anyway. I'm debating it. Yeah, let's flood fill. Okay, I'm going to select the vertices of the tip of this finger. And I'm going to grow selection until I get right down to the last edge ring, a part of that finger. Right there. Okay, so I'm going to be able to flood this one with influence. So paint, skin cluster, and let's go down. This should be L. There we go. So middle, L1. Oh, I turned off the bones layer. There we go. Middle L1 is this first joint that controls the entire finger. I'm going to flood these vertices with 100% influence on that joint. That means these other two will have none, but it's going to be an easier job to add their influence back in than it would be to eliminate absolutely everything else. But I can also see this has lots of influence in the palm. That's okay. It's just bad if it has influence in the other fingers. So middle L1. So we're on replace, 100%, 100% opacity, flood. There's a finger. Great. Okay. So now I'm going to, we could use select. Let's do that. So without exiting the tool, I just select the select mode. I'm going to grab these vertexes. Grow, 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 grow. One more. Grow. There we go. Switch back to paint. Okay. Now we want it to be ring 1 flood. There we go. There's a solid finger. Okay. Select. Tip vertices. Row that selection until we're in the final ring that is just that finger. Go back to paint. Pinky 1 flood. Great. And we'll do this for the pointer finger. And obviously we do this with the thumb as well, though the thumb tends to mess up in this way less because it's further away. So it's usually not necessary. I somehow got off track with the vertices. So I saw one select that shouldn't have. So now I'm just checking that this one, that one, and these other two are not selected. Yeah, I don't, oh, there we go. This one should not be. This is right between the webbing, so I don't want that one. Yeah, that should be fine. All right, so now we go back to paint. Pointer 1 flood. Okay, cool. And you can see some of this like needs to be reduced, obviously, but that's the part that at least gets the fingers looking like fingers to start off with. Okay, so right now the bending is not possible for any of them, but at least we have a finger that can move properly. So the other part though is if I grab this pointer finger and I use the bend control, see, nothing is happening now because all the influence was taken away for every finger, for every joint. What would have happened before is that the bones that, let me just turn it back on, the bones that are bending would have been affecting the neighbors in an annoying way also. So I'm going to leave actually the control in this weird position, and I'm just going to bend, let's bend down all the way and up all the way, down all the way, and up all the way, so that as I paint in the influence going down these fingers, then we can see it take effect. I'm going to ignore the thumb for now. You guys can figure that part out. No more selection, just an object. Paint, skin cluster. All right, so let's see, middle finger. And I thought I had my bones showing. Oh, okay, there we go. So the middle finger, this joint. So we are going to start out by just replacing at 100%. We can worry about smoothing later on, but the middle finger needs influence over at least these edge rings right here. So there. And if it's a little bit sloppy, don't worry, you're going to have to smooth all this out anyway. I guess I could just give it all of that. And it's going to want some influence over this, so probably like 50%. Let's go ahead and switch this to a value of like slightly over 50%. There we go. So it's still sharing, but it's not going to be like super harsh. There we go. So we'll go down a joint and do the same thing on this area, ignoring what's down over there and over on this area. And then for the fingertip, you can choose if you want to share it between L4 or not. I prefer to have the third one just have 100% responsibility for the tip of the finger. There we go. So at least we've got the right kind of influences in the right place. L1, let's give L1 50% for this joint. L2 needs 50% here and here, which it's got now. I was seeing an error where the first joint had too much influence. And then for the first joint, I'll just replace it with 0 in this joint because it really shouldn't be affecting. Okay, and as long as none of the vertices of your finger go snapping off to the bind pose or anything, then you should be good. It looks bendy, then it's basically correct. Let's do that again for the pointer finger. So an L2. we're going to replace just over 50%. And so you can see this is going to get ugly real fast when it starts to crunch in like that, but it's this area. Okay. And this one. Be careful what's behind your brush. You might accidentally paint onto neighboring fingers. L3 is going to have 50% on this ring here. And I may be wanting to shrink my brush a little bit. And then 100% for this one. So 4 should have no influence at all. 3, 2, and 1. And 1 has too much. So I'm going to remove it, replace it 0 for this one. Yeah, that looks right. Okay, so yeah, it's now it's taken on kind of that square shape that it should. The inside's all messed up. You're going to want the bend to be less extreme when you're fine-tuning this. In essence, for each one of the knuckles, the outside will almost always round down, and the inside will pinch. So for the inside, give more influence for longer for the previous bone and the next joint, and for the top, make it as smooth as possible. So let's go ahead and unbend the middle finger. I'm going to use the middle. I'm going to rotate this one all the way down so that we can just see this one. I'm going to rotate it up and then bend it more gently forward like this, just so it's real. I know this is horrifying, but just so we can see it. And then I'm going to paint, as an example. All right, so the middle joint, right, that one, we can smooth. I'm going to turn the opacity down for the smooth brush. We just want it to share across the top and over here as well. Nice and smooth there. And for this one, we're going to just make sure that it has a diminishing influence across this. So more on this ring, less in the middle, and then even less. And I can do that. Oh, I switched off my tool for a second. Sorry. Okay, I could do that by using replace and just choosing the value. So I'm thinking like no more than like 15 to 20% value on this ring. And I do have to shrink the brush at this point. So I want it to have minimal influence over here. I'll go ahead and do it for the pad also, just to start off with. It might be correct. Okay, I don't know. Oh, opacity is very low. All right, I'm going to set the opacity to 50%. Okay. And then for the middle, it should have about 50-50 influence. I mean, just about exactly 50-50. So we'll set it to 0.5. Let's make sure the brush is small enough. Okay. See, it does look harsh on the bottom. And then for the previous bone, it also needs 50-50 in that area. Okay. And then this one, it's near 100%, but not quite. So we'll do 80 something. Okay, so we are getting a pinch down there and a round shape up on the top. It could be as simple as that. Let's see how that feels when I'm controlling it. So it's just a little over harsh on the inside. The outside looks great. Over harsh on the inside. So what that typically means is that we're just going to smooth it out a little bit more generously, where the bone has more influence on the previous point and the previous bone has a little bit more influence on the next joint. That does tend to shrink the size a little bit as it bends, but it's okay. It's a balance. Let's try. So I'm going to get my smooth brush. I am going to turn the opacity pretty far down as I try to do this. So here's the previous, sorry, that's the previous bone. Oh no, yeah, it's these two. Sorry, I had it wrong. All right, so let me try smoothing, especially over here. I'm just going to keep going across it a bunch. Let's try this bone. Smooth is not doing a lot. What can I do? I could give this one more influence for this joint so that it's further away. Oh no, that's what's making it rotate. Yeah, I do need less. Maybe I turn my opacity too far down. No, it's pretty much as smooth as it's going to get because there's very few vertices here. Yeah. So I would have to now start like maybe adding a bit of influence where previously I wouldn't have thought it belonged. So I'm turning this down to a value of 1. Opacity is still low. I'm going to add more influence to this previous bone to the pad of the next finger and the middle position there. And now try to smooth. Now see, that just reduces it again. That's odd. This doesn't even have full possession over this ring. Should really have more. I think maybe that's part of what's making the smooth not work properly, because this one is not smooth and it takes its neighbor's weight into account. So it really does need more influence on its own knuckle. Something like that, just judging by color. Okay, so at least it won't act as strange when I'm smoothing it now. Okay, let's see. I mean, it doesn't look that bad, especially for a very low polygon joint. It's probably about as good as it's going to get. I mean, it's nice and round. It maintained its volume all the way down to this maximum squish. You can see here's the untreated one that looks much worse, and here's the treated one that looks much better. Yeah, as long as the fingers are maintaining their volume and smoothly bending on the outside knuckle and sort of tucking into a sort of pinch on the inside, that's all we really need. Okay. There are better ways to structure your topology than is evidenced on this rig. Look it up sometime if you want to know about good modeling practices setting up for rigging. It's a worthwhile thing to know, especially if you're going to try to be a character modeler. Okay. Let's go ahead and zero all that back out, and then zero out the bends as well. Okay, so that's just kind of an example of how to treat the fingers. Then let's also go ahead and do the jaw area, because that's one that freaks people out. I'm just going to hit increment and save. So for the jaw, what I tend to do is lean the head back and twist the neck a little bit so that the shoulder area is workable, and then just open the jaw, right, like that. And it'll be obvious what's happening once we start to paint in the face, but just open the jaw, not a crazy amount, but a semi-generous amount, because there's a lot of painting that needs to go on here. All right, so here we've got a much shorter list of bones, which is good. It's going to help us to do this work. First thing is what belongs to the skull. That tends to be a slightly easier choice to make. They're the things that shouldn't move. So that we've got the head joint, right, is right in the middle here of everything. We could have zero influence on this, or this could be the one that we're talking about, and we never affect skull at all. So I think what I'm going to do, we could zero this one, or we could zero the skull. I'm going to zero the skull. So I'm just going to flood a value of 0 for the skull bone. Okay, no influence. So that should transfer it to the rest of them. Yeah, so like chin, we can reduce a little. Jaw is going to be the very interesting one. Head is what needs most of the influence. So I'm going to replace with a value of 100%. Everything that's kind of above the eyebrows, the scalp line, everything up here. And it might be worthwhile to hide the geometry of the hair, just so that it's easier to do this first step, especially since we have that hair sitting there. But the teeth and stuff are actually helpful, so don't hide those. Let's go ahead and do that. So in the geometry, where's the hair? I'm just going to turn that off so that it's not in the way. There we go. Okay, so the whole upper skull area. And stop at about the occipital lobe back here, because that's going to start to share between the neck and be a bit squishy. But you can paint this 100% influence kind of along the temples, above the eyebrow line. Kind of like that. Upper ears is fine. Okay. So sort of like that. Okay. So now it's sort of a question between how do we share between head and jaw, because neck doesn't enter into it until lower down here. Jaw needs to have obviously 100% influence all the way down here, and chin is another one we got to zero out. So let's zero chin out. I'm going to flood at 0. There we go. So jaw, see, that turned much redder. Let's paint on 100% influence in the chin area for that. And avoid the mouth area for now. Just chin and lower down to here. So I'm going to shrink this just a little bit. In fact, don't really go very far back into the face at all with this one. This is one where the mirroring is going to be necessary, but might mess up just a bit because it's so complicated. Okay. And we're going to remove influence on this one above the nose area. So value of 0. So up here, and you're going to see it's going to look pretty weird for a little bit. And then it'll start to resolve into a better shape when we finally get down to the last bits. Don't know what that was, but need to go. Okay. So this is the jaw rotate. It is going to have some influence over here towards the ear area. So don't worry about that, but it's not actually going to have much on the back of the head. So we can get rid of that. Anything behind the ears. We don't want the neck flexing because of jaw rotation. That is cool. I mean, there are the mastoid muscles, but it's kind of beyond the scope of this rig. This is a very simple rig. We also really don't want the jaw to influence very much down even the front of the neck. So sweep down a little bit, like leave some influence towards the change in planes here, but down and into the chest, we don't really. This could be a good one to hide the t-shirt as well. Let's do that. That was body. So I'm going to do that as well. Just because so much of this is overlapping and hard to get at. There we go. So this is the jaw. We don't really want the jaw affecting anything down here. Definitely not. Here. Okay. And I know it's messy. Don't worry about symmetry until your last kind of cleanup steps. All right, so we've got neck and head influence. So head influence is okay to come pretty far down here, but I'm going to eliminate head influence from this part that goes under the t-shirt. Okay. That's where neck influence should really have more. Okay, neck influence is still stretching way up here into the face. We want to zero out all of that. You can see how there's so much stuff. Okay. So neck should not have any influence into the actual face up here. Pretty much jawline and up, ears, possibly earlobes, possibly a little bit in the back of the head. I'm not entirely sure about that one. Remember that you don't have to paint both parts of the face, but I'm just kind of doing it automatically as I'm going around, so I'm not thinking about it. Because mirroring will help. Best to return your mesh to the default pose before you activate mirroring, though. Okay. And you can see there's some inside the mouth that's hard to get at. This will become easier once we properly assign jaw to be opening that mesh. Then we'll be able to see a lot better in there. For now, just do your best. Okay. Something like this. Making sure this side's cleaner. Okay. Head, jaw. Okay, so now jaw, we have to remove, but not completely zero, most of what's up here. Actually, nose is safe to zero, so we can do that one. At least the upper part of the nose. It will squish a little bit on the under part of the nose, but it does end up looking very ugly at first. Tell you what, for the sake of making this workable, let's just use 0 for now. You're going to see the top lip starts to teleport upward. It's not going to make it look great. It's going to be like a puppet, like a blocky face. And if you go a little bit too far, then the bottom lip moves up. Let me shrink my brush. Okay, go very careful. Go very careful around the corners. Top is okay. Roof of the mouth. So it's separating the skin. There we go. But it's okay if the corners of the mouth are hard to get because they're actually shared. They're about 50% influence. They're not 100 or 0 because that gives it the soft kind of shape. So you'll have stuff like this where I've painted out the influence, but it's still reaching towards something. That means like the chin or the head or something. There we go. Doesn't have enough influence. The neck there, the neck has influence inside the mouth that we couldn't see before. So now I'm going to get rid of all of that. And then, yeah, the neck should not have any influence down here. A little bit safer to look out the mouth so that what's behind your brush isn't like more geometry. There we go. Okay, so you see like it's this puppet kind of square mouth at the moment. All right, let's get rid of the cheek area. All right, let's see if mirroring works on this right now, because at least it'll get the left and the right under control. So I'm going to hide the bone and geometry layers. Just grab all that stuff I was just messing with and 0. Let's turn the bones and geometry back on. Okay, it is just this mesh we're concerned with. All right, so let's mirror it. I'm going to save first. Skin, mirror, skin weights. It should be all the same stuff. Positive to negative, closest point, joint, label. All of that should be the same for every skin that we try to mirror. Apply. And now let's go take, oh, not that. I wanted to play with the controls. Okay, so it is opening and closing. There's some sort of error behind the eyes in there, and the ears look super harsh, but at least it will make it a little bit more symmetrical. What happens if I move the head? That's not too bad, really. And the neck. Neck should be more twist than bend. So if the neck looks weird when you do this, that's fine. The neck doesn't really do that so much. But twisting is the part where you care more. It's not bad, really. I think the neck and skull is working fairly well. Let's go ahead and reopen the jaw. I try not to go side to side with the jaw too early because it just kind of confuses me. But let's do that much. And the eye shouldn't be influencing anything because we made sure of that. So let's go ahead and continue painting. So now we're going to have to start sharing the influence between jaw and head, because that's what's going to make the mouth opening more realistic. Let's do a replace. No, let's do smooth. I'm going to turn down the opacity a little bit, but if I start smoothing in this area where white becomes color and color becomes black, then they'll start to take on a more median kind of influence, and the shape of this mouth will soften out considerably. Okay. Realistically, the sharing area between head and jaw kind of extends up the cheeks just below the eyes. It does extend to the nose, in fact, to the nasal fold, extends all the way into here, and underneath the nose as well. So it's not going to be 100% even on this part of the lip, but it's going to be very, very near 100%. Then as you come around the side, it will become more 50% when you're in the, kind of think of the smile area, that cleft in the lip. And then as it goes down and around, it's going to have influence all the way to the lower lip, even like 25% around this area or so. So it's quite a lot of sharing to get it to a rounder shape. You'll notice it's getting better and better as this rounds out into an O rather than like a yell or a puppet kind of look. And everything can be shared all the way down to the jawline too, right up to that line. All right, let's go to the jaw. That one was losing influence, so it needed more. The jaw needs more influence stretching up and needs to lose a bit of influence here on the lower lip. Another reason you have to click so much is that smoothing is sharing between the neighboring values. And so when you first click, it shares between some pretty harsh ones, and then it shares between less and less and less harsh ones as you go. There's some sort of error in the middle of the cheek here. But you can see it's a little bit better, just not gaining very much in the lower lip at the moment. Let's see what's going on. Chin's not taking on any, skull isn't either, neck isn't either. I think I just need to add some influence to the head for the lower lip. So let's add a very small value. Right around here, around the side, and down here, which will smooth out in a little bit. And you may have to fly your camera to the inside, right, to bring the inner vertices up as well. Okay, something like that is okay. Let's add some from the jaw to the upper lip. The mouth will close a little bit as you do this, but it should close in a round way. So trying to turn that green at least. And this area can be, you know, kind of cyan or green. And even little bits of all the way up here can start to turn kind of cyan or green. Blue should be the center only. All right, let's try smoothing. There we go. Starting to get closer. Oh yeah, the jaw is, okay, it's getting back influence there, so I want to come back to the head and give it a little bit more. Oof, he looks melty, so melty. As long as nothing else is taking on the... Okay, spine 2 is taking on all sorts of influences. Okay, I didn't see that coming, so let's replace with 0. I don't know how spine 2 got all these little messy influences. That may have been effect. Oh yeah, it's very high up actually. So this could be a job for like grabbing everything and flooding. Yeah. All right, let me Turn off bone layer. Grab these vertices, everything this high up pretty much, and let me grow the selection even. I'm going to deselect. So this is spine 2. Spine 2 should really only affect what's way down here. All right, so I'm going to flood all of that to 0 for spine 2. Don't know how it managed to get that. Replace 0 flood. Okay. Back to object mode. Okay, here's head again. Okay, so now it's adding back a little bit of influence up there, which is nice. Good, smoothing that out. Got the right shape on this part of the lip. Okay. There we go, getting rid of those bumps and weird things which snuck into it. All right, then down here, there we go, smoothing it out a bit so it's got less influence. There we go, it's rounding back out. On the inside, on the outside, and the trickiest part is always in the corner right there. All right, let's try it with the jaw. On the jaw side, I feel like the jaw maybe has lost a little bit too much influence. So I may need to add, yeah, it's not round enough, so the jaw needs to have more influence in the middle and then tapering off. So let's add fairly low amount, higher opacity. There we go. So we'll give more back to the center, all the way up to about 100% really. And then this can be redder, oranger, and then yellower. It needs more in the middle. Yeah, it actually needed a lot more in the middle of the cheek here. Yeah, it can be redder and then greener for longer. See, it should pull down the side of the lip a little bit like that. I'm going to give it more influence going up to the cheek and lower eye area, because I think that's where we were losing some of the value too. And then underneath the jaw area, that's okay. It can have 100% for now. It does actually share between the head, so this becomes squishier, but since we're doing this part, it's okay. Okay, let's try smooth. Smooth that all out. Maybe on the head down here. It does need some influence, just a little bit. Smooth tends to favor removing influence, I feel. Maybe it's just the way I'm using the tool. Okay. It's not bad. It's a smoother shape now. But we're still not quite there, and it honestly, it's very fiddly. It's always very fiddly. But you can see at least that side looks like just a slack opening mouth. And then I might want to think about mirroring what's going on underneath the eye there is what I want to know. Oh, it's the eye socket shape or something. It's kind of getting in the way. 5. So head. Okay, so I'm going to replace 100%. Shrink my brush a little. Try to fly in here. I guess, you know what? Hiding the eye mesh as well. Let's hide them both. We'll have a sort of rubber Halloween mask now. There, because you can see the mesh back there. Paint, skin cluster. There we go. So be careful in this situation where I'm looking through down. I don't want to mess up what I've done down there, so I'm going to turn around inside to do this lid. Right here is dangerous because that's behind there. There we go. Probably handle some little parts of the ear while I'm over here. Ears are more flexible, but just want to make sure it has the right ownership to start off with. Do the other socket because I'm paranoid it won't work if I mirror it, but it probably would. Okay. Okay, let's see. Smoothing again. So this doesn't look very smooth, but just pay attention to the way that the mesh is deforming to try to judge it. Left and right mirroring kind of messes it up a little bit sometimes, but we're kind of getting there. We're in the ballpark. Jaw, chin, skull. Okay. Jaw can add a little bit. And then we do sort of smooth this out with head. To make this throat area a little bit more pliable. Let me see if is it actually sharing with it. Yeah, it is. Okay. Especially underneath the jaw area, it's good to allow that one to extend quite a ways because it'll make this fleshy area a little bit more pliable as well. Let's add just a little bit. And then smooth it out. Okay. Should jaw really be affecting down there? Not really. Neck, that's fine. Spine. Spine keeps creeping up. I think spine, because it's the root bone, is the thing that takes on influences that drop too low. Clavicle, okay. Neck. I can have a bit right there. Head. All right, and then we just gotta check and see how much that has done. I mean, obviously there's still some issues in here, and I'm looking at the topology for this, and there aren't enough edge rings moving away from the corner of the mouth. And there's quite a lot going up and down here and here, so probably that's going to affect it a little bit too. Let's go ahead and turn the bones and controls, or sorry, not the bones, just the controls back on, so I can zero all this back out. check the bones in geometry to see if it looks neutral again. I believe so. Okay, and let's try to mirror skin weights and then see how this... Okay, so there's still some error, especially in the middle. Right, now you can see where the teeth are showing through when we open sufficiently, meaning that that needs more influence on the skull portion to move less. But look how the flexibility of the lower part of the nose is kind of satisfying, and how the flexibility in the cheek area and the earlobes is a little bit satisfying too. Obviously, it needs careful treatment, but with enough work, you can really make that stuff feel pliable and natural. Let's look underneath as well. The throat and neck is feeling a lot better now as well. That kind of squishy feeling that this is all flesh and not bone. And we want to keep that jaw nice and straight and strong. We don't want to share the jaw bone area in particular, though back here you kind of have to, where jaw exchanges for flesh. So you can see a lot of progress has been made. We're definitely not done or anything, but this is the process of getting this nice. Running through this entire process in this video would mean that this video would run for hours. So I'm not going to continue demonstrating that. I've shown you a finger. I've shown you basic joints like the elbow, talked about mirroring and paint weighting in the body and the neck and the symmetry. We didn't do any of the belt loop stuff. Just know that whatever the weights are for the belt loops should probably be almost exact, if not exact. And it would be easiest to just treat the belt as a rigid thing bound only to the root, and to do the same thing for the belt loop and the buckle. And then the leg is going to be much the same as the arm. So I don't want to keep you watching this while I'm just fiddling around with it. What I may do is continue with a time lapse where I'm messing around with the face and the arms and show my results. But until we have this step complete, then our rig is not done. So we've got all the function, but now it's the beauty pass here of making sure that all of the meshes properly deform when controlling it. But the greatest thing is, once you're done with this step, you're completely ready to animate. Okay? So hopefully that helps. If this is the end of the video, then I will talk to you guys next week. And if I have a time lapse, then I might sum up at the end of that.